Welcome back to my YouTube channel, Your English Teacher. I am Ritu Bhandari and today we will be doing the line-wise explanation of the text of the second chapter of Snapshots textbook for class 11. The chapter we are going to study is The Address by Marga. Earlier, you must have visited the video which gives a summary of the chapter. And in the next videos, we are going to discuss the text questions, the SEQs and the LEQs. Please do visit them as well. So this is a story about the human predicament that follows the pre-war and the post-war period of World War II. Mrs. S was a Jew, a rich lady, and the other character, Mrs. Darling, was a non-Jew. The daughter of Mrs. S had lost her house and her mother during the war, and now she had decided to come back to take her possessions, her mother's possessions, from Mrs. Darling's house. Mrs. Darling had been an acquaintance of Mrs. S, and she had offered to take care of her mother's belongings, the narrator's mother's belongings, till they came back after the war. But actually Mrs. Darling had no intention. She had an ulterior motive. She was an opportunist. She had no intention of giving back Mrs. S's belongings because she never expected them to come back alive from the war. So let us see how the story unfolds itself. Before we do that, let's study something about Marga, the writer. She was born on the 31st of March 1920 in Netherlands. Her pen name was Marga. She was a journalist and she wrote in Dutch language. Her real surname was Menko with an E, but an official accident switched the first vowel and then she left it as Marga Minko. So let's proceed with the story. The text. Well, you knew my mother, I asked. I here refers to the narrator, that is Marga. Have you come back, said the woman. The woman is Mrs. Darling. I thought that nobody had come back, only me. A door opened and closed in the passage behind her. A musty smell emerged. I regret I cannot do anything for you. I've come here especially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. It is not convenient for me now, said the woman. I can't see you another time. She nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside should be disturbed. I stood where I was on the step. The curtain in the front of the bay window moved. Someone stared at me and would have asked what I wanted. Oh, nothing, the woman would have said. It was nothing. So Mrs. Darling does not welcome the narrator. She doesn't even open the door that properly. She doesn't want anybody inside to know that she has come. It seems as if she was hiding something from the people inside the room. And what she must have been hiding, in retrospect, it is actually the fact she never told her children that the belongings that they were using were actually the belongings of another person whom she had offered, of Mrs. S, whom she had offered to take care of. Maybe the family members don't know about that. So let's go on. Do you still know me? I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. She had opened the door a chink. This is a chink. This is how much you open the door. I came closer and stood on the step. No, I don't know you. I'm Mrs. S's daughter. So she blatantly refused to recognize her. She held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. Her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. She kept staring at me in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken. I thought perhaps it isn't her. I had seen her only once fleetingly, and that was years ago. It was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stepped to the side. She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan, so she recognized that. The wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. That means she has been wearing it for a long time. She saw that I was looking at the cardigan and suddenly half hid herself again in the door because she realized, Mrs. Darling realized, that the narrator had recognized her mother's cardigan. but I knew now that I was right. This is what had further confirmed that she was at the right address. The way she had refused, that is, Mrs. Darling had refused to recognize her, made her think once whether she was at the right address or not. But when she saw the way Mrs. Darling behaved when she recognized the green knitted cardigan of her mother, she realized that definitely she was at the right address. I looked at the nameplate again. Darling, it said, in black letters on white enamel. And on the jam, this is a jam, on the jam, a bit higher, that means somewhere here, was the number 46. As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother who had given me the address years ago. Remember, her mother is no longer alive. It had been the first half of the war and I was home for a few days, so this is a flashback. And it struck me immediately that something or the other about the rooms had changed. I was home. This was when the narrator was maybe not present at her home during the war. Now this is a flashback and she is recalling how she got to know about this address. I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately that something or other about the rooms had changed. I missed various things. My mother was surprised. I should have noticed so quickly. Then she told me about Mrs. Darling. I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother, whom she hadn't seen for years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. So the mother realized that it was so surprising that the narrator could have noticed that certain things were missing. Why were they missing? Because Mrs. Darling, that is the acquaintance of her mother, had offered to take care of her things. Every time she leaves here, she takes something home with her, said my mother. And the mother is full of gratitude that this lady, Mrs. Darling, without even realizing that she has an ulterior motive, she's full of gratitude that she's taking things home with her. She took all the table silver in one go, and then the antique plates that hung there, she had trouble lugging. Lugging means pulling with great effort. Those large vases, and I worried she might get a sprain in her back from the crockery. My mother shook her head pityingly. She was full of compassion. She was a kind person, sympathetic, that see how much Mrs. Darling is going through. She might even trouble herself to the extent of getting a sprain in her back, and she was full of sympathy when she saw that this is the effort that Mrs. Darling is making. These instances give us an idea of the character of the mother. I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. She even insisted. This shows that Mrs. Darling was an opportunist. She wanted to save all my nice things, and this shows that the mother of the narrator was actually so simple and so easy to trust others that she didn't even realize that Mrs. Darling actually had an ulterior motive. She was an opportunist. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says, and therefore she said that she will take care of them and give it back. Have you agreed with her that she should keep everything? I asked. Now, as a child, if I see that my mother's belongings and my home belongings are being taken away by somebody, it would be a bit emotionally challenging for me. So the narrator, that is Marga Minko, directly asked her mother, have you told her she can keep it even? Now the mother got angry and she said, as if that's necessary. It would simply be an insult to talk like that. Obviously, so she thought that yes, Mrs. Darling is going to give it back. There's no need to even say that to her. And think about the risk she's running. She's doing that for us. Each time she goes out of the door with a full suitcase or bag. So the mother did not like the narrator questioning this act of Mrs. Darling. And therefore, this also depicts her character. My mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. She looked at me reprovingly without any love and disgust, and after that we spoke no more about it. So she did not want any question answers related to this. This is a very common scene when a mother says something, that's all, and that look in her eye tells you that you better not pursue this matter. So meanwhile, I had arrived at the station. Now this is present tense, without having paid much attention to the things on the way. On the way means because this is the first time she is visiting. Who? The narrator is visiting Mrs. Darling and going to that area, which was actually her home, first time after the war. She did not particularly notice the things on the way. I was walking in familiar places again for the first time because this was where she had spent her childhood. First time since the war. But I did not want to go further than was necessary because it is very emotionally challenging to go and visit those places where you must have spent time with your mother, your childhood, which is no longer a thing of present. I didn't want to upset myself with the sight of streets and houses full of memories from a precious time. She didn't want to delve into those emotions. In the train back, I saw Mrs. Darling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. This is again taking you back to those days in the past. She, that is the narrator, saw Mrs. Darling in front of her in the train the day after her mother had told her about her. She had got up late and came downstairs, and on that day she saw a woman with a broad back introducing her to Mrs. Darling. She said that this woman was the one who would be taking care of her belongings. Mrs. Darling had a broad back and she wore a brown coat with a shapeless hat. The narrator asked, "Does she live far away?" seeing the difficulty with which she had to go out of the house with a heavy case. My mother said, that means the narrator's mother said that you need to remember the address, number 46, Marconi Street. I had remembered it, so I refers to the narrator, Marga, but I had waited a long time to go there. Initially, after the liberation, I was absolutely not interested in all that stored stuff, and naturally I was also rather afraid of it. Afraid of being confronted with things that belonged to a connection that no longer existed, which were hidden away in cupboards and boxes and waiting in vain until they were put back in their place again, which had endured all these years because they were things. This is the gist of the chapter, students. Over here, what does it mean? It means that because they were things they had endured, they were able to bear the passage of this time. But for her to go up and muster up the courage, go up to that address to collect her mother's belongings after the war was a big step. It would require a lot of effort. Because she says here, I was rather afraid of it. Why? Because when you go and visit a place which has your mother's belongings and memories attached to it, it is an emotionally challenging act. You have to muster up courage to do that. It's not easy to go and face those things, especially when you know your mother, whose those things were, is no longer alive. But gradually everything became normal again. So after some time, even after the liberation, after the war, when things became a bit normal, it took her a month or so, she decided to go. Now here, this description in this paragraph is going to tell us about what all were the after effects of war. Bread was getting to be a lighter color, lesser adulteration in food. There was a bed you could sleep in unthreatened. Otherwise, you were always afraid that now there would be an attack. Suddenly, you'll have to run away. A room with a view you were more used to glancing at each day. Every day you are staying in that same house. You're not shifting places, running away to save your life. So these are the things that everybody in a war situation has to go through. So things were getting normal again. Bread was getting of a lighter color. There was a place where you could sleep unthreatened without the fear of getting caught or the fear of running away. And you were staying in a home which was more permanent, near to permanent. And one day I noticed I was suddenly curious about all the possessions that must still be at that address. I wanted to see them, touch them, remember them. So after a long time, after the liberation, after the war was over, she mustered up the courage and decided to go to Mrs. Darling's house. Now the first visit was in vain, where Mrs. Darling blatantly had told that she had not recognized her. But again she decided to go there for a second time. Now a girl about 15 opened the door to me. She appeared and she asked and the narrator asked her if her mother was at home. She said no, and she's gone out for an errand. Errand means some chore, some work. So the narrator said, I'll wait for her. She followed the girl along into the passage. Now this paragraph is going to tell us about what were the emotions when the narrator entered the house for the first time. The moment she enters the house, she recognizes an old-fashioned iron Hanukkah. A candle holder hung next to the door. Now, we never used it. This is the hint. The word we never used it means that she recognized that this was her mother's belonging. This is a Hanukkah, and they never used it because it was much more cumbersome than a single candlestick. Here you can see you can have at least 7, 8 candlesticks in one holder. Won't you sit down? So the moment she has entered, she's recognized that her mother's belongings have been used. Asked the girl. She held up the door, opened the door of the living room, and I went inside past her. I stopped, horrified. I was in a room I knew and did not know. I found myself in the midst of things I did not want to see. I did want to see again, but which oppressed me in the strange atmosphere. Or because of the tasteless way everything was arranged, because of the ugly furniture or the muggy smell that hung there, I don't know. But I scarcely dared to look around me. The girl moved the chair. I sat down and stared at the woolen tablecloth. I rubbed it. My fingers grew warm from rubbing. I followed the lines of the pattern. Somewhere on the edge there should be a burnt mark that had never been repaired. My mother will be back soon, the girl said. I've already made tea for her. Will you have a cup? Thank you, she said. This is telling us the emotions she has gone through. She's horrified the moment she stepped into the living room because she was in between all her mother's belongings, which she was yearning to see, but somehow it disgusted her, and she felt very upset and in pain because of the strange atmosphere in which she saw her mother's belongings. She could not pinpoint why she was oppressed. She said the narrator tells us that it was either because of the strange atmosphere in which the things were displayed, it was maybe the tasteless way in which they were displayed, it was maybe because of the muggy smell of the furniture. Something she could not pinpoint made her feel really oppressed, and it just killed her. It touched her soul, left a scar on her soul. She sat down. She didn't know what she was doing. Subconsciously, she recognized a tablecloth. She was searching for a particular line of pattern, and there she knew if it was her mother's tablecloth, it would have a burnt mark, and it was there. Now, when she looked up, when she saw the burnt mark, the girl put the cups on the tea table, and she had a brought back as well. Just like her mother, Mrs. Dorling's daughter, 15-year-old. She poured tea from the white pot, and all it had was a gold border and the lid. I remembered. So even the tea cutlery was what she was using, was of her mother's. She opened a box and took some spoons out. That's a nice box. I heard my own voice. It was a strange voice. This is also a very powerful line. At times we don't even realize what we are speaking, and our own voice seems to be alien to us. This was a situation for her. She was so poignant, so full of emotion, so overwhelmed that she didn't know what she was saying. And each sound of hers was different in this room. Oh, you know about them? My mother says it's antique. We've got lots more. See for yourself. And she might have directed her with her hand where to find more antique. But the narrator says, I had no need to follow her hand. I knew which things she meant. I just looked at the still life over the tea table. As a child, I had always fancied the apple on the pewter plate. This is a pewter plate, children. A plate where you display your fruit. And we use it for everything. Once we even ate off the plates hanging there on the wall. I wanted to so much, but it wasn't anything special. I had found the burnt mark on the tablecloth, and the girl looked at me questionably. Oh, really? Is that you are here to show me that the tablecloth has a burnt mark? Yes, I said. You get so used to touching all these beautiful things. You hardly look at them anymore. You only notice them when something is missing because it has to be repaired or because you have lent it, for example. Indirectly, she has let it out. The narrator has let it out and said that I was maybe looking at everything and I found this burnt mark, and maybe it has offended you, but this is just a way to make sure and make one realize that at times we don't even recognize the importance of things in our houses, and we do notice them when they are taken away from us or they have been lent. Actually all this has been lent to Mrs. Dorling, and the poor child doesn't even know about it. She thought her mother might have got it from an antique gallery. Again I heard the natural sound of my voice and I went on. I remember my mother once asked me if I could help her polish the silver. It was a very long time ago and I was probably bored that day. Or perhaps I had to stay at home because I was ill, as she had never asked me before. I asked her which silver she meant and she replied, surprised, that it was the spoons, the forks and the knives, of course. And that was a strange thing. I didn't know the cutlery we ate off was actually silver. The girl laughed again. I bet you didn't even know it was either. I looked intently at her. Why? Because that is the same cutlery that belonged to her mother. What we eat with, she asked. That is Mrs. Dorling's daughter. Well, do you know? She hesitated. She walked to the sideboard and wanted to open a drawer. Look, it's in here. She went out of curiosity to get more. I jumped up. Somehow, something happened to the narrator at that point of time. Maybe she was so full of emotions at that time she could not bear the sight of more of her mother's belongings. I was forgetting the time, she said. I must catch my train. She had her hand on the drawer. She refers to Mrs. Dorling's daughter. Don't you want to wait for my mother? No, I must go. The girl pulled the drawer open. I can find my way, she said, as the girl was much more busy finding the cutlery because she was also surprised that the cutlery was made of silver. As I walked down the passage, I heard the jingling of spoons and forks. At the corner of the road, I looked up at the nameplate. Marconi Street, it said. And what happened? Immediately she left. Who left? The narrator. I had been at number 46. The address was correct, but now I didn't want to remember it anymore. I wouldn't go back there because the objects that are linked in your memory with the familiar life of former times instantly lose their value when severed from them. You see them again in strange surroundings. And what should I have done with them in a small rented room where the shreds of blackout paper still hung along the windows and no more than a handful of cutlery fitted the narrow table drawer? I resolved to forget the address. All the things I had to forget, that would be the easiest. This again is a very powerful passage where it gives a clear indication to the reader. What was the reason that Mrs. S.'s daughter, Marga Minko, returned from the address number 46 on Marconi Street without her mother's possessions? The reason was that she had gone there for her mother's possessions. Those possessions had value till her mother's memories were linked to it. But as she saw her mother's belongings being distastefully arranged, disrespectfully treated, she realized that those objects have lost their value because their memories have been severed from them. Her mother's belongings have actually been ill-treated and mistreated and distastefully arranged. And the way now the narrator would remember them would be they would not only have associations with her mother, they would also have associations with Mrs. Dorling. So she decided she would not like to challenge her emotions and bear all that emotional trauma, and decided to walk out. Now, when this person decides that, you can understand we as humans have a habit of justifying things. She says that anyways I have a small apartment, a small room, and even till now the black paper has not been taken off properly from the windows. Why were there shreds of blackout paper? Because they were living in a war zone. And in a war zone at night, light should not escape your homes. So they pasted black paper on the windows, so that in case there were air raids, they would not get to know that this is an inhabited area. So she started justifying, I have a small room, and only a handful of cutlery could have fitted into the narrow table drawer. But I, as a reader, ask, didn't she know about this earlier? It was the same room she had when she had gone to visit Mrs. Dorling to get her mother's possessions back. So there was actually no need to have gone then even. But actually what has happened, her mother's belongings have lost their value because the memories have been separated from them. She decided to forget the address. Of all the things she had to forget, that would be the easiest, because she did not have a good experience at that address, and that was the address where her mother's possessions had lost their value. So I hope, students, you've understood this chapter, and I look forward to you visiting the rest of the videos. As I said, the earlier one was a summary video. The next videos are going to be short answer questions, text questions, and long answer questions explained. Thank you so much. God bless you, and see you till the next video. In the train back, this is present tense, I saw Mrs. Dorling in front of me again, as I had the first time I met her. It was the morning after the day my mother had told me about her. So this is actually